On the 23rd of June, people are going to be asked to make a momentous decision about whether or not the country stays in the EU. And I know that it's a difficult decision for people. I know that not everyone has come to the same conclusion. I know if you're trying to make up your mind, you're bombarded by people saying this and then the other side saying that. It is difficult. My own view is, I've thought long and hard about this. I think this is really about jobs and our economic future. And I think it may be not so much about future for people my age. I think it's about our children and our grandchildren as much as anything, and the kind of future we bequeath to them. And of course, one of the reasons why we got young people from schools right across the constituency here today is because they won't get to vote in this, but what happens will have a big impact on them. Thank you very much for coming. Now, I don't want to take up too much time. I want to actually introduce our main guest. He's going to make the case for remaining, and then he's going to take some questions afterwards. That's a lot easier if people put up their hands. Let me do it in an orderly fashion. I'll try to get in a good cross-section. And, don't make massive impassioned speeches. We want kind of fairly straightforward, short questions so that we can get through quite a lot of it. Now, as I say, I was anxious to try and have someone come and make the case. My own sense of this is that a lot of the focus so far has looked a bit removed from ordinary voters. It's looked as if it's been about the interests of others, the kind of set pieces. So the reason I wanted a community event was because I wanted ordinary voters to have a chance to reflect and think about this. It's very tight in here, I know, but that's because so many of you have come. So without further ado, I want to introduce the man who I think is the best possible person to put this case. He spent a lifetime working for the interests of this country. He spent a lifetime thinking about our economic prosperity. He's a man I know, trust and admire. I can't think of anyone better to make the argument than the Right Honourable Gordon Brown.
Pleasure it is to be in Birmingham, to be with you today, to be with my friend Steve McCabe, who's a wonderful member of Parliament and was a great minister in our last Labour government, and to be here to speak to you and to some of the school pupils who are here today, and to many people, some of them I've met before, to speak to you about these issues of Europe. And it's very good of you coming when it's such a great day outside, and it might be preferable, you would have thought, to be outside in Scotland, where I come from. This is very unusual weather. We say there are only two seasons in Scotland, July and winter. And to speak at a social club reminds me that the last time I spoke at a social club in Scotland, it was their annual dinner. And I was invited to be the guest speaker, but the chairman introduced me in a way that was very different from previously. He said, as you know, on these occasions when we have our annual dinner, we like to have a big speaker. He said, 3 years ago we had Neil Kinnock, and as you know, he was the leader of the Labour Party. He said, 2 years ago we had John Prescott, you remember John Prescott. He said, last year we had Alan Johnson, who's heading our European campaign. And then he paused and he said, this year we've built a new social club extension. And you can't have everything. He proceeded to introduce me. Now, I want to talk today about jobs, the future of jobs. And I want to talk about what it means for Birmingham and for the future of the young people who are here today. And I want to make the case for European cooperation because it means, in my view, more jobs, better jobs. It means more opportunities for young people. It means we're safer against terrorism. It means that we can cope with illegal immigration better. And it means that we have better minimum social standards for people in the workplace. But I know that Europe is a very difficult issue, and it's always been a difficult issue for the British people. 50 years ago, when I was starting to grow up, our Prime Minister was Harold Wilson, and he decided in 1967 that the Labour Party and the government would lead the first negotiations that we had to join the European Community, as it was called at that time. And he had a foreign minister who was called George Brown, a namesake, but not a relative of mine. And some of you may remember George Brown, who was Foreign Secretary in the Labour government. And so he sent him around the whole of Europe to try to negotiate our entry into the European Union by talking to all the different countries. The problem was that George used to drink a lot. And the phrase tired and emotional was actually invented for him because that was the way of covering up that he had too much to drink. So he arrived in Paris, and some of you may know the president then was Charles de Gaulle, a very austere Frenchman. And he made the mistake of calling him Charlie, and things didn't go very well to start with. Then he insulted the French, and it was overheard on the microphone, and we know all about being overheard. Then he went to Brussels, and he thought he was cracking a joke in Brussels about Belgium. And he started saying, well, of course, the Belgian army was no good, because all the Belgian army officers spent all the time in the brothels of Brussels. So he had to leave Brussels very quickly. And then he arrived in Vienna, and things got really worse, because he arrived and they were having this huge diplomatic reception. And of course, he was the foreign minister. And they had this big ballroom, and the music was playing and everything else when he walked in. And after having had a few drinks, he misunderstood what was actually happening. And when the music started again, he thought he had to lead the dancing. And he saw this figure in purple, walked across and said, would you like to dance? And the figure said, Mr. Brown, you're drunk. Secondly, Mr. Brown, this is not a waltz. We are playing the Austrian national anthem. Thirdly, I'm the papal nuncio. So, needless to say, our negotiations didn't go that well at that particular time. Now, things have changed dramatically since 1975. But the issue has always been, are our economic prospects, are the jobs prospects for our children better? Now, I come to Birmingham, to the Midlands today, and I know from my experience over many, many years, and I've visited here on so many different occasions, that the Midlands is the manufacturing heart of the British economy. And in the last few years, despite people saying that the car industry was dead, the car industry is seeing more and more investment here. And you've got some companies like Jaguar, Land Rover, Tata, who are investing a huge amount of money now in building better facilities here for the car industry. And I'm very proud of what you've done as an economy here, and all the small companies that depend with the supply chain on the car industry and on the future of manufacturing. But you know this, that most of what we manufacture here, and particularly cars, are exported to the rest of the European Union. And we've got all these foreign firms like Jaguar that is owned from India, and of course in other parts of the country, the Japanese car companies, the American car companies, like at Ellesmere Port in the northwest. And they base themselves in Britain, not just to sell into Britain, but mainly because they think Britain is the best platform to invest for selling in Europe. And so the cars that are built here, nearly half of them are going to go to the European Union. And that's just one example of where the jobs that are created here depend not just on the domestic market here, people like you and me buying the cars, but selling to the rest of Europe. And if we didn't have these markets in Europe, then we wouldn't have as many jobs here. And it's true not just of cars, it's true of pharmaceuticals, where we've got great British companies, and they're based here so that they can sell into the European market. 56% of our exports of pharmaceuticals, drugs that we do develop here in Britain, and you've got great companies here in the Midlands, they go into the European Union as well. And you look right across it. I come from Scotland, as you know, Scottish whisky. Some people think that all the whisky in Scotland is sold to Japan and China and India and America. You know who the biggest buyer of Scottish whisky is? It's the French. They drink more whisky in a month than they drink cognac in a year. And they get exports from Britain to be able to do so. And if you look at this, a lot of people think, well, British economy, and you hear all these stories, it's China now, we're going to sell everything to China. Or India is the country that people are going to sell everything to India. Or America's still the big country where we sell to. Look at the figures. 4.5% only of our exports go to China. 1.5% only go to India. 1.4% to Australia, which is a great partner of ours, but only 1.4% of our exports. Canada, only 1.4%. Great relationships, but they only take 1.4% of our exports. New Zealand, far less. South Africa, far less. America, 15%. Europe, 45%. the rest of the European Union, and so many hundreds of thousands of jobs, some people say 3.2 million jobs in Britain, are dependent on our membership of the European Union. And when people invest from abroad in Britain, they invest to create jobs here, but of course to sell into Europe as well. And again, we think it's Korea or Japan or China or America that's investing here. The majority of inward investment into Britain and to this region comes from the rest of the European Union. So you can see hundreds of thousands of jobs, and the future of the jobs for young people coming up depend on our membership and our trade with the European Union. So you might ask, well, why is it the case? And I think there are many people here who will be thinking this. So the jobs case is made for Europe, but why are so many people still sceptical then of the European Union? And I want to explain why and then answer that question. You think, why is it the case that when most people think that the arguments being put by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and Ian Duncan Smith and all these great friends of mine, all these arguments have been put, people agree that the jobs argument goes in favour of remaining in the European Union. 3 out of 4 people in the recent opinion poll said, if it came down to the question of jobs, we would stay in the European Union. So why are so many people worried about other issues? And why do some people think, even if I was worse off, I might even be prepared to vote to leave the European Union? It's because, of course, people have concerns about other things as well. And we've got to answer these concerns also. People have concerns about security, how safe we are. People have concerns about what kind of country we are, what are we becoming? And therefore they worry about our identity and whether it's at risk. People think that we get a lot of jobs, but we also lose a lot of jobs. And you know, since George Brown and Harold Wilson tried to negotiate our entry into Europe, and since all these things happened, we've got some phenomena that is really changing all our lives, and it's globalization. We're part now of a global economy. We're an interdependent world. Jobs can come and go depending on decisions made in any other part of the world. People think globalization is like a runaway train. It's out of control and uncontrollable. But you know what happens? There are huge opportunities, but there's also huge risks. Globalization maximizes our opportunities, but it maximizes our insecurities. It means that people should know that we need to cooperate with other countries, but it also awakens in us a need to belong. So on the one side, the logic is greater cooperation with the rest of Europe. On the other side, some people want to say, let's bring control back home. The world is too difficult, it's too dangerous, it's too unsafe. Let's bring control back home. And what we've got to do in arguing about Europe is say, look, for Britain, what is the best arrangement? How do you have the autonomy and the identity that you want, and at the same time have the cooperation that you need? How can we have the national identity that we feel passionate about, because we are British and English and Scottish and Welsh and Irish, while at the same time get the cooperation that is needed so that we have the jobs that I've been talking about in the future? And I want to say that being in the European Union, in the way that we're in the European Union, is going to be the best way that we can achieve both things in the future. We can be proud of our identity, but at the same time, we can cooperate through the rest of the European Union so that we can get the jobs we need, and as I'm going to show, be protected against terrorism, be safer when we're dealing with illegal immigration, and have the best deal for young people for the future. So look at jobs. Where are the future jobs going to come from? And everybody is asking that question. Well, I would say the biggest job creator over the next 10 years is going to be through the single market of the European Union. Now, I was the person who was Chancellor and then Prime Minister, and we rejected joining the Euro currency. So I cannot be accused of saying, I support Europe whether it's right or wrong. I only support what's right in Europe when I think it's in the national interest of Britain. I don't fall for the argument that we've got to support everything that is European, whether it's good or bad. But I tell you this, when I opposed the single currency because I didn't think it was right for Britain, I also said, we have got to be right at the heart of the European single market, because that's where the jobs of the future are going to come from. And if you look at these jobs, jobs in the digital and IT industries, jobs in energy and environmental protection, jobs in the financial services, jobs in all the range of services industries. At the moment, we find it difficult to sell into Europe, but the reforms that are being proposed for the European single market mean hundreds of thousands of jobs for the young people here in the future, because we will get in to selling into all the other 27 European countries with these products that we are in Britain very good at. And just like we've succeeded in cars, and just like we've succeeded in aviation and pharmaceuticals, we can get thousands of more jobs in the future. So at one and the same time, we have the autonomy we want, we set our own interest rates, that's what having our own currency means, we have our own fiscal policy, make our own decisions, but at the same time, we cooperate with the rest of Europe to get all the benefits of a level playing field in Europe so we can sell our products without barriers being put up by other countries in Europe. And it's the best deal, in my view, for Britain. Now, I've always argued that you should never have an economic Berlin Wall between Euro countries and non-Euro countries. And when I was Chancellor, we had this argument with the French at one point, because I said, look, we want to be part of all the other decision-making processes in Europe. And the French said, look, you British, he said, you invented clubs. You should know. You're either in the Euro or out. You're either in the club or out of it. And so the French tried to kick us out, and we said no. And then you may have heard of a guy called Mr. Strauss-Kahn, the finance minister of France, who got into a lot of trouble with his personal life. And he compared it, said, you British, you want to be part of this Euro area decision making, but you don't want to be part of the single currency. He said, it's like being a voyeur. You want to be like a voyeur in a married couple's bedroom. And I said, no. I said, we want to be part of the decision-making process because we know that all the different decisions that are going to be made about the future of Europe, about growth, about trade, about environmental, we want to be part of it. And we insisted that we remain part of all that decision-making process, and that is what's happened. You know, I first met this guy, Delors, who was the main architect of the changes in the European Union in the 1980s, with my friend John Smith, who was the Labour Party leader, some of you may remember, who died tragically in the early 1990s. And we went to see this guy, Mr. Delors, Jacques Delors, a Frenchman, and he was running the European Union at the time. The first words he said to me was, Mrs. Thatcher, he said. Mrs. Thatcher, he said, she hates me. And then he said, she hates me for 8 reasons. He said, she hates me because I'm French, because I'm a socialist, because I'm a trade unionist, because I'm a bureaucrat, and he said, she hates me because I'm a federalist. And we said, look, we do not support a federal superstate. We are not on the road to integrating everything. We are going to get the balance right between the autonomy that we want as Britain and the cooperation we need. And I believe we are succeeding in doing that by our arguments for being part of the single market but not part of the European single currency. And that's what we're voting on, to stay in Europe, to stay in the single market but not to join the single currency. And then take the other issues, energy. So we've got big decisions on energy. What is the balance between your nuclear power, your coal, your oil, your gas, and all the renewables, wind, wave, and solar power? And so we make our own decisions on that. Britain, we will continue to do so. Prices on energy, regulation on energy, our decisions. But you know also, you need to cooperate. Because you need to cooperate to deal with the carbon emissions. Because if one country cuts carbon emissions and another doesn't, then they become free riders, the ones who don't, and they're actually doing so at our expense. So we need every country in Europe to do similar things to cut carbon. We've got wind and wave power in the North Sea, and we want to use that, but it's intermittent. The wind doesn't always blow, even though the weather's pretty bad in Scotland. But the wind doesn't always, just like the sun doesn't always shine. So you need to use your wind and wave power as part of a bigger energy mix, as part of a wider energy pool, and you've got to be part of a European energy pool to get lower prices, to get the best security of supply, to be able to meet your carbon targets by cutting the use of other fuels in favour of renewables. And that's why in energy we need cooperation in Europe. And then take the issue of terrorism, because it's a huge issue after the recent atrocities in France and Belgium. And some people might say, oh well, you're a lot safer if you just get out of the European Union and just shut up the shutters here and everything's okay. It's just not the case. Terrorists operate across borders. They work in different countries. They're planning different events that cross different borders and cross different countries. And we need cross-border cooperation if we're going to be able to track these terrorists, prevent them making havoc with our lives, and prevent them causing atrocities in the different capitals of Europe, including in the capitals of Britain. And you can track terrorists from the Middle East through Europe and into Britain, and you can track terrorists that are moving across Europe, but you need cooperation amongst the police forces, amongst security forces, amongst people who are part of the surveillance process, so that you can protect yourself best against terrorism. I cannot see how you can effectively protect yourself against terrorism in the modern world unless you have cooperation across Europe. And those people who think we can do it on our own will then find that without cooperation we do nothing about the tracking of terrorists across Europe, and we need that cooperation. And when a poll was done a few weeks ago, it said, do you need security cooperation in Europe? Then the vast majority said yes. And some of the people saying yes were wanting to leave the European Union, but the only way to have that security cooperation is to be part of the European Union. You can't do it on an ad hoc basis. You can't say, if I'm worried about something, I'll phone you up and then you'll help me. You need systematic ways of monitoring terrorist interventions, and you need to follow their operations right across the European Union and sometimes beyond as well. And for our security, therefore, we need to make sure that we have cooperation across Europe. And it's the same, you know, when dealing with illegal immigration, which is our biggest problem. People coming to our country illegally, without any ability through a visa or any other way to get into our country. And how do you track these people? How do you stop them before they get here? How do you make sure that they can't get into your country through people smugglers, through traffickers? You've got to deal with these criminal gangs across a European stage, because they're operating not in one country, but right across Europe. So if you want to tackle the biggest problem in migration, which is people illegally coming into our country, it's true in America, 11 million illegal immigrants. India's got 20 million illegal immigrants. Europe's got hundreds of thousands, and we have got to stop them. And the one way we can stop them getting into Britain is by having cooperation in Calais and right across Europe to stop terrorism. So when it comes to the issues, energy, environment, terrorism, security, illegal immigration, the jobs of the future, cooperation is going to be the way of the future, and the best forum in which we can cooperate and do the best by the British people is through cooperation with Europe, without submerging our national identity and without ruining our ability in so many of the different areas, like having border posts and border controls of our own army, our own navy, unaffected. But we can do best by using them with the advantages of cooperation in Europe. So what do the Brexit people say? What does Mr. Boris Johnson say when he's asked all these questions about the future? He says, leave Europe, he says, and join the world. And then you look around the world, and what does America say? Stay in Europe, don't leave it. And what does Australia say? Just heard the Prime Minister. Stay in Europe, don't leave it. What does the Commonwealth say? Stay in Europe, don't leave it. Michael Gove, that fascinating politician, he was saying, oh, but we could have a good relationship with Albania. But even the Prime Minister of Albania says, don't leave Europe. And the only person I know who's actually an international figure, I wouldn't call him an international statesman, who's advising us to leave Europe, is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, you know, he was asked who the three greatest Americans were, and he said the other two were George Washington and Ronald Reagan. So arrogant, really. Someone said he's lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. And if Donald Trump is the only person internationally of any renown who's advocating that we leave the European Union, then this idea that we can leave Europe and simply join the world, and everybody's waiting for us to leave Europe and they're going to link up with us, is simply untrue. And then they say, but sovereignty. You're giving up sovereignty. But what about America, the most powerful country in the world? Does it say we have to have absolute sovereignty? No. They share the sovereignty in NATO because they promise that anybody under attack will have American support. That's sharing sovereignty. They share the sovereignty in the World Trade Organization. They can be penalized for breaching the rules of world trade. And so they've got to share this. In NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Association, they've got to share the sovereignty. What is the real issue here? Because, you know, one of the things in Britain, some of you may know, is that there are sovereign American bases, military bases, and surveillance centres in Britain, part of our relationship in NATO. So America has sovereign territories within the British state. And do we hear Ian Duncan Smith or Michael Gove or Boris Johnson complaining about that? That, you might say, is our sovereignty given up? For a better purpose, you may say, but certainly our sovereignty. Do they complain about that? No. The real issue is not about sovereignty, it is prejudice against being part of the European Union. And we've got a duty to point out that what is right for Britain is to have effective control over your decision making. And when it comes to pollution, or it comes to financial crises and instability, when it comes to dealing with pandemics, when it comes to dealing with trade and growth, to have effective control of your own decisions means you've got to cooperate with other people to get the results. It is obvious in the modern independent world that's the case. And then take this argument, but Britain is no longer Britain because we're part of the European Union. And this idea that they talk about and say, well, remember Britain 1940, Dunkirk, and we stood alone, a race apart, an island unto ourselves. And they say that's the model. We can bring control back home and be an independent nation again. But you know, the Britain that I remember, and this is a club where we had air raid wardens meeting in the 1940s during the war, and they were the people who were protecting our security. We were not an inward-looking country. We were an outward-looking country. We weren't isolationists. We were internationalists. We intervened in Europe to make sure that the world was free because we knew that if things went wrong in Europe, on the mainland, it affected Britain itself. And just think of it, what has happened since then? For more than 1,000 years, European nations fought each other, murdered each other, maimed each other, in wars that spread across the centuries and affected everyone and meant that there was huge loss of lives. In every generation and in every century except this one, Europe has been at war, people fighting each other, and of course in a battle for supremacy. The Dutch, the French, the Spanish, the Germans, the Italians, Britain vying for supremacy in Europe. Think back to our great-great-great-grandparents and their generation. They fought at Waterloo, then they fought in the Crimea, then they fought in Ypres and the Somme in the First World War, where 90 million people died. Then in the Second World War, Dunkirk, Arnhem, the battle that took us all to Berlin, 60 million people died. And just think, we are the first generation where Europe is at peace. And the decisions that are made and the conflicts are resolved, not by war and by armaments, but by debate, by dialogue, by decision making, where we try to negotiate a solution so that there is no conflict anymore. We have swapped and exchanged what you might call swords for plowshares. Now, of course, in the European Union, there may be too many plowshares as a result of the common agricultural policy, but we have exchanged swords for plowshares so that we never have to resort to swords again. And this is one of the high points of civilization, that you can move from a warring set of nations who were fighting each other only 70 years ago, who are now at peace, and it's not just a truce and it's not just a ceasefire. People know that that peace is embedded because we have a system of decision making, which means that we can sort problems by arguments with each other and not by using armaments and weapons of war. And that is one of the great achievements of civilization, and we must never forget that what we want is a Europe at peace, so none of our children will ever have to be conscripted to fight in a war in Europe again. And I also want to say this, that Europe has done something else that is really important to all of us. Because Europe is not just a marketplace. It's not just a place where we sell goods. It's a place which is a community because there are social standards that have to be met. Just remember the maximum working week. It is a common right that every worker now has across the whole of the European Union. Holiday pay. It was never the case that people were guaranteed holiday pay, but it is a common right now across the European Union. If your company went bust, there's a law called the Transfer of Undertakings, where across the whole of the European Union, everyone has a right to be considered as an employee of the new company with the same rights that they had when they're in the old company. And this is a Europe which is not just a marketplace, but a community where workers have rights. And we do this because what we don't want is a race to the bottom with countries competing against each other to have the lowest standards for workers so that they can get the jobs at the expense of the others. And we try to avoid the good employer and the good country undercutting the bad and the bad undercutting the worst in a race to the bottom that means that exploitative employers can benefit where everybody else loses. And we have decided that markets need morals, that markets may be free, but they can't be values free, because markets are underpinned by social rights that people have as a result of being members of the European Union. Now, we can do this in our country, but if we don't do it across the whole of the European Union, then countries that are have less social standards than us can try and steal our jobs. And it's to prevent that happening that we have these rules within the European Union. So we are talking not just about a marketplace, we're talking about the ability to deliver a peace in this century that was built only since 1945. And we're talking about social rights for your families and for the young people who are coming up to have jobs in the future, so we're not undercut by exploitative employers who take jobs from this country and put them in other countries as a result of lower standards and what's called social dumping. And you know this, something else. One of my great friends, and someone who I admired as the greatest person of our generation, was Nelson Mandela. And I happened to meet Nelson Mandela on many, many occasions. And his wife's birthday was the same day as my younger son, and his birthday was the same day as my son. So we exchanged presents. And I met him in Johannesburg, I met him in Mozambique, where he spent some of his time, I met him in London. And he came to London for his 90th birthday, and let me tell you this story. He arrives to celebrate, the greatest man in the world celebrating his 90th birthday, and he wanted to raise money for his children's foundation. And his children's foundation was to build a hospital for children in South Africa in an area of greatest need where there was no provision for even the sickest of children. And he wanted to raise millions of pounds, so he had people deliver gifts to him so that he could auction them there. And he donated what he called his letter to a child. And this was a letter he'd written in prison, advising children about how they might live their lives in the future. And it was up for auction. All the Hollywood celebrities who were there, Bill Clinton was there, they were all there, and they were bidding for this. And so the prices just got out of control because people were genuinely trying to help them. And there was only 2 people left after we got to the phenomenal figure, 900,000 for this letter. And it was Oprah Winfrey, you remember on TV, and Elton John bidding against each other. So Oprah bids 900,000, Elton John 950,000, Oprah Winfrey 975,000, Elton John $1 million, Oprah goes 1.1, Elton pulls out, and she gets it at 1.1, and then this American lady is told that she's paying in pounds and not dollars, so it costs her 30 or 40. Great British success story. And then we had this pop concert, and all the pop singers came to sing for Nelson Mandela. All the famous people. And I was actually sitting next to Mandela, and I was having to explain who these pop singers are, and I was probably the worst person in the place. I had my kids there. And eventually we went down to meet all the pop singers. Nelson Mandela, by the way, he was wanting to drink a glass of champagne, but his wife, who was worried about his health, was forbidding him to do so. But I took the view, it was his 90th birthday, he was the greatest man in the world, perhaps he should be entitled to a glass of champagne on his birthday. So he was hiding it from his wife as he was drinking. We went down to see all the pop singers, and so Amy Winehouse, the late great, and it's very sad she's dead, but she comes up to Nelson Mandela at the time and she said, "Mr. Mandela," she said, "my husband and you have a great deal in common." And Mandela's stumped, he doesn't know what to say. What is it? "Yes," she said, "both of you have spent a great deal of time in prison." Mandela's message at night was quite amazing. He said, "Look, in my life, I've managed, as President of South Africa, to bring together black and white, racial reconciliation in a country that is split down the middle because of apartheid. The only way forward in this world is finding a way to work together. You have to cooperate or you pay the effect in lost income and jobs, but you pay the effect sometimes in conflict and in division." And Mandela's message, we are part of an interdependent world. We work better when we work together, is true also, as he would have told you if he were here today, when we talk about the European Union and the future of cooperation in Europe. You know, because Germany's population is going to fall or stagnate, Britain will be the biggest economy in Europe at some point in the next few decades. And that is a huge achievement. The small countries in Europe, they look to Britain as a leader. We gave Europe the chance to rebuild after the Second World War. And you know this, we are the British people. We fought a war for freedom in Europe because we knew that freedom was indivisible. If we didn't have it in Europe, we would not be free ourselves. After the Second World War, just remember this, it was British troops that went into Bergen-Belsen, that concentration camp, and exposed the horror of the Holocaust. And we said to people we would fight, fight, and fight, so there would never be anti-Semitism or prejudice or racial discrimination across Europe again. And then we wrote the European Convention of Human Rights and sent out a message that everybody in Europe had the right to individual liberty, to democracy, and had the right to the rule of law. And that was a testament to democracy, human rights and the rule of law that now means that no country can be part of the European Union unless they're a democracy, unless they support human rights, unless they support these values that we hold to be essential values of being British. And then when the Soviet tanks were rolling into Eastern Europe, remember, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, we said that these nations in Eastern Europe, if they supported democracy and human rights and liberty as we did, they too would be welcome as partners in the European Union. And then when we see the tyranny and insecurity on the borders of Europe, we say to people, support democracy, human rights, rule of law, these great British values, and we will work with you to help you develop for the future. And these are British values. And these were values promoted by British people. And these were values that European leaders accepted as essential for the future of Europe. And so I say to you, it's not enough for Britain just to be a member of the European Union. We are leaders of this European Union. And we should take our rightful position as being one of the leaders creating a better future by cooperation in Europe. The answer in this referendum is very clear to me. Whatever anybody else says, progressive Labour voices telling people about the rights that people have as a result of being part of the union, the jobs that will come in the future, the answer is not to leave the European Union. The answer is to lead in it. And that's the message we should be putting forward. Thank you very much.
Gordon, thank you very much. Will we sort out Gordon's microphone, which is, I think, misperformance is coming.
I think I'll ditch this one as well. Right, I just wanted to say we're going to have time for a few questions. Just want to mention a couple of people before I do. I said earlier we've got pupils from Baverstock and Bourneville Secondary School. We've got Kings Norton boys, Kings Heath boys, and Swanshurst girls. So if you do want to chip in at some point, feel free. I've also spotted about 4 of our victorious council candidates in the elections last week who are around the room. So well done, folks. That was a great result. And we've got my colleague Emma Reynolds from Wolverhampton, who's Labour's former shadow spokeswoman on Europe, and someone who is a pleasure to work with at any time. Emma Reynolds. Oh, and I've just spotted that Richard Burton's here. My apologies. Richard, my colleague from Northfield. Thank you. The rule is you should never start name checking people because right, so I think we're about ready to run. So I'm going to try and take questions in groups of about 3. There's lots of hands going up, and I think we've got a couple of people with roving mics. So I think we'll start with. Can you get in this gentleman here?
Shall I go? Like first good speech. So for me, like the main reason to vote Remain is that like a lot of my friends at university are from Eastern Europe, and they're quite worried about what's going to happen to them if we leave, and they're going to have to leave after their degree and things like that. And something that you didn't really look at in your speech was like about the sort of positive sides of immigration. I just wondered whether you thought that should be promoted more by the Remain campaign. I mean, sometimes politicians, you know, even yourself, when you talked about British jobs to British workers all those years ago, you know, they sort of buy into more into the concern side rather than like, here are the benefits of immigration. Or do you think more that should be emphasised by Labour in particular?
Thank you. So, benefits of immigration. What about up here? Is there anyone up here? Take this gentleman here.
I'd go the opposite way of that. What are the problems that we're getting because of immigration, the uncontrolled immigration from the EU? We have controlled immigration from the rest of the world, but we don't control it from the EU, and that's causing vast problems with the infrastructure, schools, housing and NHS.
Thank you, Steve. Not a high-tech audience. Positive benefits, dangers, and what about this lady over here? Ladies. Yeah, you.
Do you think that if we vote to leave the EU, we should be concerned about the powers that be in our country creating a race to the bottom in order to create new jobs with less benefits and less protection for our kids in the future?
You know, I sometimes have problems with microphones. It's a bit of a history, so I've got to be very careful. And I do welcome Richard, who's been a great MP fighting for the car industry, Emma, who works very hard to put the case for Europe in Parliament, and is one of our outstanding MPs. And I welcome all these councillors here who won your seats. I wish you well. When I first was a member of the Labour Party, someone came to me and they said, and I was still a student, they said, would you like to stand for the council? Would you do so? And I said, look, I don't know much about council finances, and you probably think even when I was Chancellor I didn't know much about it. He said, I don't know if I can do this. And he said, look, Paul, if we're going to win the seat, you wouldn't be the candidate. So I got a very interesting baptism to the Labour Party when I first was considered as a candidate. These are very important questions about immigration, about the benefits of immigration, and about the costs of immigration, and about what imbalance is the real issue in immigration. Now, immigration, as you know, as an economist will tell you, it provides benefits to the economy because your growth rate is high, you have more workers in your economy. You can get skills that sometimes are not there in Britain because there are people with skills who are ready to work. Most of the people who come from Eastern Europe are very highly skilled actually, and many of them are graduates looking for jobs. So there are clear benefits to the economy if you can have higher growth and you can have more skills, and obviously you can have more productivity and more growth as a result of it. But the costs of immigration, of course, are borne by individual communities, because if there is a higher number of people in that community, there is pressure on your health service, there's pressure on your schools, and there's pressure, obviously, on the different public services that are involved. So the balance, getting the balance right, is incredibly important. I would say to you this, that if there is a problem about pressure on services, we should deal with it by making sure, even now, whatever your final decision is on migration, by making sure that those communities who are facing these pressures on schools and hospitals have the money to do so. And there should be a fund across Europe where we support each other when we're under pressure by giving those communities, and there are communities in Britain affected by high levels of immigration or refugees or asylum seekers, we should give them the money that is necessary for them to provide proper services. When you actually look at the polls that people do, people recognise that there are many people who are immigrants to our country who do jobs that British workers have not been prepared to do. There are many people who recognise that there are these exceptional skills that are being brought to our country, that the health service, for example, has got lots of nurses who are trained in other countries, and we get the benefit from it. So yes, we've got to get the balance right between these things. Now, when you say the biggest problem is the ability of people to come from any part of European Union and work in Britain, I would say you're wrong. The biggest problem that we face in migration is if people come to our country illegally. And that's where we get into the biggest problems in our country. There are people coming in through people smugglers, there are people coming in through gangs, criminal gangs, there are people coming in who are trafficked into this country. They cannot be registered properly because they are here illegally, and this is going to become the bigger problem in the years to come, and you can only deal with it by cooperation between the different countries of Europe. If you think you can solve the migration problem without cooperation with the rest of the world, then you're wrong. The only way to solve the problems and to get the balance right, as I've suggested, between these difficult issues where there are pressures on services, but equally there are needs that are met sometimes by skilled workers who come into the country, is by having some control, by coordination and cooperation with other countries. Now, if people come to this country from Eastern Europe and have got any criminal convictions, we have the power to throw them out. If people come from Eastern Europe and if they don't meet the standards that are required, we have powers to throw them out. We have the European arrest warrant where we can take people back to countries. We have the ability to take people out of the country. We do not have open borders because we are not part of the Schengen system. We don't have open borders because we have our own border guards and our own custom guards guarding our borders and checking people as they come into the country. And that is an important element of getting the right balance between the autonomy that people want. We make our own decisions on these issues about border guards and having the cooperation that is needed to deal with problems like illegal immigration. So yes, you're raising important questions. But yes, too, if we are to stop people coming into this country and therefore offering themselves for lower wages than British workers would normally command, the way to do it is to properly enforce the minimum wage and minimum standards in the workplace, and to deal with exploitative employers who are trying to use migrant workers to push out British workers. We can deal with that also by the criminal law in Britain. So when you look at this issue, it is very complex. There are several million people in Britain, of course, who were born in Britain, who live in other parts of the world. There are more than 1 million people who are British citizens who live in Europe, many of them in Spain, but many of them also in other countries. And in this changing world, the students that we're talking about will want to be able to travel to other countries and often work in other countries for different points, at different points in their life. People want there to be more mobility so that they have more opportunity to decide where they work as well as what they work on. So getting the balance right is what's important. And I tell you, from my experience, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer and as Prime Minister, the biggest problem we face in the future is illegal immigration, and you cannot deal with that without cooperation with our European partners. Thank you.
Can we take the young man at the back there again? No, tap your hand or something.
Okay.
Somebody else.
Just asking, with David Cameron and George Osborne wanted to stay, some of their arguments, such as family households could lose up to £4,300 a year, they do seem slightly over-exaggerating certain points. Do you not think that could make the people making cases for the Out campaign, who seem to have arguments which are more grounded, seem like the more reasonable side?
Okay.
Michael Gold's the more reasonable person.
Yeah, this.
What do you think the EU will look like in 50 years?
50.
What do you think the EU will look like in 50 years? And there's somebody up here with a hand up.
June Jones. It was great for you to talk about in your speech about the single market, not just speak about free trade, free markets, but also about markets with morals. I wonder, do you think we should be talking more about the moral dimensions of the single market, not necessarily the jobs numbers, but also, as you say, the moral dimensions, and should we be talking more about that?
Okay. Now, you mentioned the arguments being put by David Cameron and George Osborne. And who am I to defend them? I'm not here to defend the Tory party, and I'm not here to defend the Tory politicians. What I would say is you've got to get this balance in the debate. You've got to point out the costs if you leave, but you've also got to point out the benefits if you stay. Then to look at where are these jobs, what are these jobs, how can I say to my children, how can you say to your children that they're going to be better off or worse off if we are in or out of the European Union? And I've got no doubt, having looked at it, that the jobs of the future, probably the biggest job creator is going to be from that single market in the European Union. Why? Because it's 500 million consumers, and therefore they're buying British goods. Why? Because this is a market where people have more money than perhaps in other parts of the world to spend, and therefore the trade will be higher as a result of that. Why? Because even when China is rising, and even when Brazil and South Africa and India are becoming more important, they still will remain a very small part of our trade for many, many years to come. You know, we used to say in the 1940s and 50s that our Commonwealth trade was the key to our future, and 40% of what we exported from Britain went to the Commonwealth. But now it's only 10%, and it's not going to come back quickly. And as I said, Australia and Canada and New Zealand, they used to say, stay with us and in the Commonwealth and don't be part of the European Union. They don't say that anymore. So the key question then is, where are the jobs of the future to come from? And therefore, I don't use these days. And that, in my view, the main trading area will remain for many, many years to come, will be the European Union. And of course, we've got to develop trade with these other countries, but it will take time. And if you're thinking of jobs in the next 10 years or next 20 years, they're going to come from the European Union. And that then raises the question that was asked about what happens in the next 50 years. You know, when I was thinking about what we did about the euro at the beginning of the century, and we were deciding what decision to make about whether we joined or didn't join the euro, and eventually we decided on balance it wasn't the right thing for Britain, but we wanted to be part of the single market. Mervyn King was the governor of the Bank of England. He'd just become, I think, governor of the Bank of England at the time. And I said, well, what's your view on it? He said, well, it will take 200 years of statistics for me to be able to give you a judgment on it. So predicting 50 years ahead is quite difficult, given that he couldn't tell us for 200 years what the position was. But I would say, if you think of the world as it develops, this is going to be a more interdependent world. You see, young people that I know, and they think nothing of travelling right across Europe and travelling even beyond that, whereas when we were growing up, it was very unusual to travel even abroad at that time. Young people are connected right across the world by the internet, and they could be in direct contact instantaneously with people in any part of the world. So this is going to be a more interconnected, and a more interdependent world. We're going to have a global middle class that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I hope we can get rid of much of the poverty that we're affecting. But make no mistake about it, there'll be large numbers of people in Africa and the Middle East who feel left out of this world, that they don't have the opportunity. And if you think you could be better off by being poor in a rich country like ours than rich in a poor country, you may try to get here by illegal means or legal means, simply because it thinks it gives you a better life. And so we are going to have a duty to do something about the Middle East and about Africa, to make sure that life is better there, so that people don't feel the need in millions to leave Africa. You just think of it, Europe's 500 million people. Africa is more than 1 billion, twice as big at the moment. By 2050, Europe 500 million people, population roughly the same. Africa 2.5 billion, 5 times as big. And if there's not prosperity for these countries and they're not doing better, then the tendency will be for people to want to leave. And therefore, I think we've got to do more as a Europe in providing help to the Middle East and to Africa so that they can be more prosperous in the future. The worst thing that we could say is that by 2050, 35 years from now, we would have as much poverty in Africa and the Middle East as we have today, and we have done nothing about it. And you know, we can't do this on our own. We can't solve the problems with the Africans or the Middle East populations on our own. NATO can't do it because it's a military organization. America is actually quite far away. And while they may share the same interests, we've got urgent problems because of the problems on our borders with terrorism and migration. The only way to deal with these problems is Europe to get together and have a coherent policy that tries to deal with some of these issues that arrive in Africa and the Middle East. So I say to you, 50 years from now, we want a more prosperous Africa and the Middle East. We want stability and security there. Equally, at the same time, we want to have guaranteed better jobs for the future, for the generations that are going to come after that. And I see no alternative to better cooperation starting in Europe to do so. I mean, what message would we send out on June the 23rd? And I put this directly to you. If we, the country that has been the most internationally minded of nations, the country that people look to across the world as some country with global influence, what message would we send to the rest of the world if we decided there and then that we're going to break off our economic relationships with our nearest neighbours? I think people would be shocked that a country as global as Britain had decided to turn its back on our nearest neighbours and therefore on a very big part of the world. And I think that is the message, cooperation as opposed to isolation, that we should send on June the 23rd. Thank you.
To get some women to ask some questions. So we'll start with you. Where else?
Just me. Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for bailing out the banks and saving people's mortgages. Their savings, and that's a fact that wasn't given enough credit
by selling our
in
gold
these
really
last
cheap.
few years. Thank you for that. Thank you to the Labour Party for their part in the European Court of Human Rights. On which point, I myself represent 19% of the population who are obviously disabled. and the Tory government is absolutely crucifying us. They are taking away our livelihoods, our rights, our freedoms, and our rights to independence. I'm a stormer of Westminster, by the way. Yeah, I was there. So, how can we have our rights protected more? How do we get access to that protection, either in or out of Europe? We need help before we're all exterminated, basically.
Thank you. So, how does Europe protect our rights? Let's have this lady here.
Thank you. How are we protected against the transatlantic trade agreements? Because, as that lady over there said, if we don't have the care left here,
Stay in Europe, you're not.
how are we going to deal with it?
Thank you. And where was the lady that was over here? Right.
And my question was about the TTIP as well, actually. That there's been a lot of talk about the economy, but actually this decision seems to be being made in the shadow of a secret agreement. We don't know either way, whether in or out, how it might or might not affect us and our rights. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Let's take this lady up here.
Hello. My personal view is that all of this about Europe, whether in or out, is all a bit of a distraction. There are much bigger things that we need to be dealing with in the world today. In particular, global warming. I want to ask a question to Gordon Brown about what he said this morning. You put a big emphasis on the importance of trade and more trade within Europe. And yet there's quite strong evidence that the more we trade and send stuff miles and miles across the seas to far-flung places, that the more carbon emissions are going out into the atmosphere and increasing global warming and climate change. So, in a way, these two things, trade and global warming, are almost like in opposition against one another. How do we reconcile those two together?
Well, these are all incredibly important issues, and I hope I can do them justice. I am publishing a book, Leading Not Leaving, and the proceeds go to charity, and I try to deal with these issues in the book in more detail. So I'll try and give answers, and if you want to write to me or if you want me to develop them, I will do so in the future. First on climate change. Look, the only way that I see that we could get a climate change agreement in the first place was by Europe banding together and having their own pressure on America and on China and on the other countries. I remember being part of the climate change negotiations in 2009, and Europe had this position: we would cut carbon emissions by 30%, but we couldn't persuade America and China at that time to do it. But it was only because Europe held strong and said, we're not changing our position, we're going to continue to hold to that position, that by 2015, America had now come on board and China had now come on board. Without the collective organisation of Europe promoting the climate change agreement, I don't think we would have had one. And that means that there are cuts in carbon emissions, and countries have got to declare what they're doing and be tested on whether they're actually cutting their carbon emissions properly. And that means that we can have less global warming and try to meet the targets that we have set for cutting the carbon emissions and therefore dealing with global warming as a result of it. So all the arguments, in my view, about climate change point to the need to have European cooperation to start the process off. And Europe's got by far the most ambitious agenda on climate change, and that means, as I said in my speech, that wind power and wave power are going to be very important, because renewables becomes a far more important source of energy than, say, coal, and in time, fossil fuels like oil and gas. And therefore, if you're worried about the environment, and I am, and if you want to, if you like, hand over a better environment to our children, we cannot avoid the need for that cooperation, and that cooperation starts in Europe. And then the trade agreement that you raised and other two speakers have raised about TTIP. We will and must have the final decision on whether we sign a trade agreement as Europe with the rest of North America, with the rest of the West in North America. That negotiation as you say, has been secret until now, although I think all the papers were leaked only a few days ago, and you can find them in the newspapers. And there are serious disputes between America and Europe. And I think Europe is standing for the right position. America seems to want at this stage, in this trade agreement, to allow companies who are unhappy with what's happening in their trading arrangements to be able to have an arbitration process that is binding, whereas Europe wants it to be clear that it's got to go to a democratic process and you have courts that will adjudicate as to who is right and wrong. And these issues will go on and we'll have to discuss them. There is no agreement at the moment. In fact, there is no possibility of agreement until these issues are resolved. And there's other issues like Canada, for example, exporting to Europe chicken, for example, that is battery produced. And Europe does not want to have these low environmental and health standards. People in America using GM food to feed up poultry and everything else. And Europe does not want to have GM food import or GM imported into Europe by this back door. And these are all issues that are unresolved, and it may be that the trade treaty cannot be agreed. But I don't believe that you can actually reach a conclusion on this without having an open debate in Britain and in the rest of Europe. And Unison, which is a very good union, and I'm very admiring of the work that they do in protecting people, I don't think that the NHS is in danger of privatisation as a result of this agreement, and I would never support an agreement that involved the threat of that happening. And I think I could assure you, with all the evidence that we have, that that is not in danger either. And Unison, despite all the representations they've made about this, they are convinced enough that they are advocating that their members support remaining in the European Union. So we have a debate about a future trade agreement. It is between America and Europe. If we got that trade agreement, it would have advantages, but it can only be at because we have solved some of these problems that people have raised with us, that we have proper protection for environmental standards, proper protection for health and safety standards, proper protection, which I think we do have, that there is no question of that forcing the opening up of contracts for healthcare and therefore the privatisation of the National Health Service. And with these assurances, we might be able to sign an agreement, but without these assurances, I don't think any agreement can be signed. And I don't think that should affect your choice as to whether we're part of the European Union or not. And as I say, Unison, which is the union that has raised these issues most of all, has looked at the issues of all of them together, and the members voted only a few days ago that they wanted all of us to remain as part of the European Union. And then this question that you rightly raised about the rights of disabled people. Well, what's really interesting is that now there is pressure, and rightly so, that any disabled person across the whole of Europe should have basic rights. And that is now being discussed in the European Union, because what you don't want is to have standards in one country that are undermined by poorer standards in other countries. And if we can help lift the rights of the disabled people in all the countries of the European Union together and make provision for employment opportunities, for training opportunities, and for better health and safety provision for disabled people, we should do so. We know when we were in government, we created the disabled tax credit to enable disabled people to have the chance of working in the same way that others have the chance of working, but with proper remuneration for doing so, instead of being subject to low wages and worse conditions. We have come a long way, but we have got a long way to go to make sure that disabled people have equal rights in this country and they're protected against discrimination. But one way we can ensure that happens is making sure that there are rights for disabled people that are common and that there are minimum standards across the whole of Europe. And that is now rightly in the agenda on Europe. And if you give me your address, I'll write and tell you what the proposals are that will mean better rights for disabled people. We can solve some of these problems, but the answer, in my view, again, is not to give up on the cooperation that can yield results in Europe, but in some cases to make it better cooperation and to make it work more effectively for the British people.
If you're very quick and very brief, we can probably get in one last round, and then that's it. I don't know if it's a coincidence that the meeting lights and Brexit has undermined disability rights so much, but there you go. Anyway, let's take this young man here, let's take this chap here, and let's take the guy in the red shirt back there.
Good speech. Recently, in an article in The Guardian, there was an article on the British industry falling into recession again, and I was just wondering that you mentioned industry in your speech and how staying in the EU would protect us from this again?
You spoke in your speech about swapping ploughshares for swords. You spoke in your speech about swapping ploughshares for swords, and David Cameron, I believe, and I'll just bring it down briefly to what he said. He talked about Europe possibly being destabilised by Britain leaving.
Third World War.
The threat of terrorism is obviously something that is in our lives even more than it was in the 70s with the IRA and all of that, with the events of the last couple of years. But I personally cannot understand how Europe would be destabilised to the point of potential war by Britain leaving, unless it would have a domino effect and you think that if we left then one other country would and Europe would disappear. So if you could just explain how us leaving would make us more in danger of being a Europe at war, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
And the chap in the red top at the back there.
Hi, the main argument being made by the Brexiters, however it's hidden, seems to be actually about immigration. So they hide it under things like economy and other things. And you've mentioned, yes, we need to do a lot more to reduce the inequality globally, but I think we also need to do a lot more, and you did allude to this. I believe the Labour government actually did have a fund for areas that are under particular pressures through immigrant community arrivals. I think we need to up that a lot. There's no point in telling people that immigrants bring in £20 billion to the British economy if we're not allocating any of that back to the communities who are actually on the front line. That is what is undermining our arguments about immigration.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, communities come under pressure for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there are floods that hit communities and you've got to come in and help these communities with a fund that will make it possible for them to rebuild. Sometimes you have health problems in a particular community that have got to be dealt with because of environmental safety and everything else. And there are pressures on communities, as you rightly say and I said, because the health service and schools are under pressure when more people are moving into one community and raising the numbers of people who are calling on these services. So I support a European fund. This should be shared across Europe. And actually, when it comes to migration and asylum seekers, it's got to be shared across the world. If there is a huge number of asylum seekers in Europe, then America and other countries have a responsibility as well, because we are helping people in difficulty. So there's got to be some sharing. And I agree with you that the last Labour government created a migration assistance fund. It's not big enough. It should be bigger. It would relieve the pressures in some communities where population is growing, and it should be done. You know, I believe in the common sense of the British people. We know that many immigrants make a huge contribution to our economy. We know that in some cases immigrants have broken the law and that they can be repatriated in many cases to the countries of their origin. We know that they do some of the jobs that other people have not been prepared to do. We also know that they have skills to offer. But we've got to get the balance right between the population of the country and the pressures we have to bear. And one of the ways we do that is in communities that are hard hit by pressures upon them, giving them the extra resources that are necessary. My complaint against the Conservative government is for too long that they've tried to make that an issue of blaming someone else, when they should just get on with the business of helping communities that are in the greatest need. Some of these questions, you know, you're asking me to defend what David Cameron said, and it's quite difficult for me to do so. You might understand why. You were saying, rightly so, there's a problem about British manufacturing at the moment. There is generally a slower growth rate in the world economy. Therefore, people are worried about when the next recession might come and what form it would take, and what we've got to do to protect ourselves against that. And there are decisions that are going to be made in Britain, and there are decisions that are going to be made in the rest of the world, because the world economy, when it grows faster, it helps Britain to grow faster. But what I would warn against is blaming everything that goes wrong in Britain on the European Union, which is what the Brexit campaign are tending to do. So every time something is reported as manufacturing face a difficulty, well, that's because we're part of the Union. Or every time you get a new figure, that's because we're part of the European Union. One of my friends when I was Prime Minister was Lula, who was the president of Brazil, who was the head of the Workers' Party, and he was a great trade unionist. And he told me this, that when he started off as a trade union shop steward, and there was a problem that had to be dealt with, He said the easy thing to do was, who's to blame? He said, oh, blame the government. And then he became a trade union leader, and things were going wrong, and he said, who's to blame? And he used to say to the press, blame the government. And then he became the leader of the opposition, the Workers' Party. And they said, well, what's going wrong here? Who's to blame? And he said, blame the government. And then he said, I became the government. And when people ask me, who's to blame for things going wrong? He said, I blamed America. And it's easy to blame someone else for things going wrong. And I think we've got to look at those problems that can be solved by ourselves, those problems that can be solved within the European Union, and those problems that can be solved by greater global cooperation. And I come to this issue then of terrorism that you raised. The reason why I say that we could make a difference in dealing not just with terrorism, but the causes of terrorism by greater European cooperation is you can see what is fueling terrorism around the world, and it's on the borders of Europe. And we cannot escape from that, whether we like it or not. There is instability in the Middle East because young people don't feel that they've got opportunities. And in these oil-rich states, or in the borders of oil-rich states, they feel that they've got no education and employment opportunities. And that feeds the dissent and discontent that led to the Arab Spring and leads to young people, some of them at least, falling prey to these terrorist organizations. And you know this, that hard power, as they call it, military power, can deal with the hardcore of terrorists. You can send the drones in, as Barack Obama has done, and you can deal with some of the problems that arise. But if 200 million young people in the region are discontented, and they feel that there's no future for them, and feel that they could support these organizations that are saying it's the West to blame, or saying that coexistence doesn't work for us and we're losing out, then we have a problem, because you can't deal with that problem by hard power. You can't simply send drones to take out every young person who's complaining or who's discontented. You've got to do something else. And why Europe matters here is it's the only organization that can really bring its collective muscle to bear to deal with some of the problems in the Middle East and to deal with terrorism within its own borders. NATO, as I keep saying, is the organization for military cooperation. But as I say, you need aid, you need diplomacy, you need economic incentives to help young people in that region get jobs and opportunities. And NATO is not in the business of doing that. It's nothing to do with NATO's business when you're talking about, if you like, civil and peaceful means of trying to get better deals for people in the Middle East. One country like us, Britain, we can't do it on our own, we're too small. And everybody would accept that. America, as I say, is far away, and its concerns are now Asia. And while it shares our interests in the Middle East, it's not immediately affected by terrorists coming across the border, or by the instability that leads to these massive waves of migration that are coming through Europe from countries like Syria. So when it comes down to it, if America can't do it on its own, and we cannot do it on our own, and if NATO cannot do it as 28-member country because it's a military organization and can't deal with these problems, we need collective clout to be able to deal with these problems. And it's not scaremongering to say that, and it's not saying that terrible things are necessarily going to happen. It's telling what I think is the absolute truth. If we do not do this, and the European Union did not exist, we would have to create it to deal with some of these problems on our doorstep. If we want to slow the migration from the Middle East and from Africa, if we want to undermine the terrorists who put an argument that coexistence is impossible, if for the sake of humanity, and I'm involved in this in the Middle East trying to help young children get to school, we are to take action to prevent child marriages and child labour and child trafficking, which have become so common in Syria and in related countries like Iraq, where young people are on the streets and at risk of massive exploitation. If we were going to do something about these problems that will build up even greater problems if unaddressed in the future, then we do need to have a common European policy, a concerted policy. And what I'm saying to you is Britain is in a position to lead this. We have got great ideas. We've got a country that's got an international reputation. We've got a history of being able to sort some of these problems out. We cannot do it on our own, but we can work with other people to do it. So in this unsafe and insecure world, it makes sense to cooperate with your nearest neighbours to deal with the problems we face. And I'm not trying to exaggerate, and this I think is the question you're raising. I mean, if people make exaggerated statements on either side, I'm not supporting them because they make exaggerated statements. I'm saying look at it as factual evidence. If it comes to jobs, energy, environment, security, cooperation against terrorism, cooperation against illegal immigration, there is no doubt, in my judgment, that we need that cooperation to make it work. I quoted Nelson Mandela at the beginning. Let me just quote another conversation when I finish. Ronald Reagan was the President of America in the 1980s. And Olof Palme was the famous Prime Minister of Sweden. And he could never get a meeting with Ronald Reagan to talk about how Europe and America could cooperate better. And Ronald Reagan refused to meet him. But finally, as Ronald Reagan's time in office was finishing, this Social Democratic Prime Minister of Sweden got his request and finally got a meeting with Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan's sitting in his office there and he's saying, this guy, Palme, coming to see me, isn't this man a communist? And his official said, no, Mr. President, he's an anti-communist. And Ronald Reagan says, well, I don't care what kind of communist he is. And so this guy comes in to meet Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan says to him, oh, you Social Democrat, you guy from Sweden, you hate the rich, you want to abolish the rich. And Palme said, no. He said, we in Europe, we want to abolish the poor, we want to abolish poverty. We want to give everyone a decent chance to have a start in life. And these values, I think we should understand, are held across Europe. That Europe is the one continent in the world which is built not just on being a marketplace, but built on there being social rights and social responsibilities that we all accept. And I would think that we would send out a terrible message to the world that Britain, which had led the way in so many different respects in building the Europe that we have, and in trying to make it a more humane and civilized place, if we simply walked away on June the 23rd. It's your decision for you to make. There are big issues at stake, but I urge you to consider that cooperation is going to be the way of the future. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time. If you like the arguments that Gordon has been making, there are some copies of his book, Leading, Not Leaving, on sale here today. I just want to point out, all the proceeds from this book go to charity. Not a penny of it is going to Gordon. So if you want to see a more developed argument, there are some copies of the book here. I hope you'll reflect on what you've heard today. As Gordon says, it is your decision. It's a momentous one for the future, and I hope you'll join with me once again in saying thank you very much.